So I'll give you a quick overview of what I plan to talk about today, starting with an introduction to MedInstitute, the company I work for. We'll talk about MRI safety of implanted medical devices, and then get into the specifics of RF-induced or radio frequency-induced heating of devices during magnetic resonance imaging. We'll talk about how we use COMSOL multiphysics for solving that problem, and then get into another specific case of open bore MRI, which is a specific type of MRI scanner. And then we'll conclude with some final remarks. I'll be sure to have enough time at the end that we can get to any questions that you may have. So MedInstitute is a medical device consulting company, and we are able to help out throughout the different areas of the product development life cycle. Everything from engineering and testing. We've got over 250 accredited test methods, everything from corrosion and tensile testing, fatigue. We've got a regulatory group that helps file regulatory submissions. We're able to help run clinical trials. I oversee our MRI safety group as well as our computational modeling and simulation group, where we're able to use simulation tools to help solve problems. We've got a device assembly group, scientific communications, and regenerative medicine. So here's a snapshot of the product development life cycle of a medical device, and we really aim to help accelerate that process. And here's where our various service offerings fit into that life cycle. So when we're talking about MRI safety, most of the time the simulation as well as the medical device testing is going to occur during this design control phase. So in terms of MRI safety, we help medical device manufacturers, our clients, evaluate their device and get labeling for their devices. There are several ASTM standards that outline the physical testing and standard test methods for that, as well as an ISO standard for electrically active implants. And then once that testing has been completed, we help interpret that and provide the labeling that can be put in the instructions for use, or the IFU, for the device. Our computational modeling and simulation group, also known as CAE, computer-aided engineering, we're able to use various computational tools, including COMSOL multiphysics, to solve a wide variety of different types of problems. Everything from computational fluid dynamics, fluid structure interactions, fatigue evaluations of various products, including stents and stent grafts, multiphysics simulation for RF heating, we'll talk about that today, and as well as material selection. So here at MedInstitute, we've been using COMSOL for over 10 years. Here's a list of the modules that we use with COMSOL multiphysics. Obviously, the RF module is important for RF-induced heating. We also have CFD, heat transfer, several of the structural mechanics modules, including the fatigue module, and the CAD import module has been very useful for us, as we have clients that are able to provide us with CAD files or CAD geometries of their specific device. We're able to import those. I'd like to start out by saying, when we were first evaluating different softwares to use before we purchased COMSOL multiphysics, we were fortunate enough to be able to team up with a COMSOL certified consultant. And at the time, I think Altasim was one of the first. And if there are a lot of you out on this conference that don't have experience using COMSOL, or maybe you are an experienced user, but you're starting to use or solve a new problem, I would just recommend you not be afraid to reach out to the experts out there. I think there are many COMSOL certified consultants, and I'd recommend that you consider reaching out to them. So in terms of MRI safety, why do we care about MRI safety of medical devices? Well, we know that there are over 80 million MRI scans a year throughout the world. And we also know that there are millions of patients with implanted medical devices. So it's really important to understand how these devices are going to behave and interact with the electromagnetic fields that are present for magnetic resonance imaging. So this is a typical closed-bore scanner for MRI. And anytime we're helping with labeling, we're trying to define some MR conditional label, that is, define the conditions for safe scanning for a particular device so that a patient, an MR technologist, a radiologist knows how to keep the patient safe. Occasionally, devices do fall into this MR unsafe category. It's equally important that patients know that they need to stay out of the MR environment if they have that type of a device. And then MR safe is another category or a label typically reserved for devices that are completely non-metallic and non-magnetic. So what are some of the MRI safety considerations for patients with implanted medical devices? The first one that comes to mind is magnetic forces and torques. You've got this very large magnetic field from the MRI scanner, typically 1.5 Tesla or 3 Tesla. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is whether or not that's going to cause the device to migrate or move in some way that could hurt the patient. You also have these gradient fields that are used for spatial localization. Those are on the kilohertz range and could induce heating or vibrations, stimulation of the tissue or even the device if you have an electrically active device. And they could cause malfunction. So that's another area for device consideration. And then we have RF-induced heating. So you've got this large radio frequency coil that's used for imaging, but it could also turn devices into an antenna where you could get some localized heating that would potentially damage the tissue. With that being said, there have been some significant injuries to patients with implants during MRI over its history. In 1992, there was a patient with an aneurysm clip that was fatally injured. In 2001, an oxygen tank fatally injured a 6-year-old boy. And in 2004, a patient with a deep brain stimulator electrode was permanently paralyzed due to RF-induced heating around the end of the electrode, which is what this figure is showing. So with that being said, the rate of occurrence of these events is incredibly low, but when they do happen, it can be catastrophic. So when it comes to RF-induced heating and the physics involved, this is a figure or a picture of an RF coil for a traditional closed-bore scanner. But the body would be inside of this RF coil. And when imaging a patient without a device, you can still get some background heating. But as soon as you put a metallic device that has the ability to resonate, you can get significant localized heating around that device. And that, particularly in the tissue surrounding the device. And so these are some of the equations that we use and that we implement within COMSOL multiphysics to evaluate that kind of heating and the thermal dose from that event. This is a resonant wavelength effect. So at the various field strengths, here we're showing 1.5 Tesla and 3 Tesla, you have different frequencies based on the Larmor frequency. And at 1.5 Tesla, we're talking about 64 megahertz for RF, and at 3 Tesla, 128 megahertz. And what that does is it shifts your resonant length. In this case, we're looking at different lengths on the x-axis of a particular calibration rod, and then the temperature rise on the y-axis after 15 minutes of heating. And you can see that at 3T, the blue curve, we've got a resonant length close to 10 centimeters. And at 1.5T, we've got a resonant length close to 20 centimeters. And so this is a frequency effect. Being at Med Institute, we are very involved in the international standards. As I said before, there are several ASTM and ISO standards that define these different test methods for evaluating medical devices, and we have the corresponding accreditations to go along with our lab. But it's important to have a good understanding of these prior to trying to start your computational model. So in this case, we're talking about ASTM F2182, which outlines the RF-induced heating standard. Here's a photograph of the gel phantom that's commonly used for that test. This is sitting on the patient coil of an MRI scanner. And here you can see a zoomed in photograph of a biliary stent where we fixtured fiber optic temperature probes at the end of the stent prior to submerging it into the gel so that we can measure the temperature rise during an MRI scan and effectively measure the RF-induced heating. These probes, just as a reference, are roughly 1 millimeter in diameter, so you can see about the size of those. As you can imagine, the groups were talking earlier about uncertainty. The uncertainty of the physical experiment itself is quite large when you start to consider movements within the phantom or placement of your probe relative to the device. And then if you start talking about a device that has some magnetic attraction or a magnetic susceptibility that then moves as you move it through the field, you can imagine how the simulation may have some added benefits over the physical test, because we don't have to worry about the static field for RF-induced heating in the modeling. And so there's some added benefits for the simulation over the experiment in that case. And so we believe that computational modeling and simulation is a potential solution for MRI labeling of these devices, and we can use that to reduce or even replace the expensive and sometimes inaccurate testing. And so we've used COMSOL multiphysics for RF heating. Here's an example of a knee implant where we're going through many different iterations and permutations, finding the worst case size, all the components that go together, the stem, the femoral and tibial trays, different material properties, where the maximum temperature rise is going to occur, whether 1.5T or 3T is going to be worse. And we can also account for anatomical and physiological effects, whether it be blood flow or, in this case, perfusion. This is a figure of our RF coil with an ASTM phantom gel inserted into the coil. As a reference, this rod here is a 10 centimeter calibration rod. To give you some reference of the dimensions, we've been able to create virtual animal models. In this case, we've got a pig that we actually physically tested, and then we used the high fidelity, high resolution MRI and CT scans to actually create a virtual pig from that animal study. And then we were able to correlate that back to multiple animal studies where we were implanting a stent in the carotid arteries of a pig. We've also been able to do some similar things along the lines of virtual humans. We've not done any patient studies that wouldn't be ethical, but we've been able to use virtual human anatomies for the purposes of getting something closer to the patient and having an understanding of how these devices behave in patients. So switching gears a little bit, we've talked about closed bore or traditional bore MRI scanners. That's something that we've got upwards of 10 years of experience, and we started to look into something called open bore MRI, and it's a very different type of MRI technology, although it accounts for roughly the same market share as 3 Tesla scanners. To my knowledge, there aren't any devices that are labeled for open bore MRI explicitly. And here's a figure of the RF coil. It looks very different than your typical birdcage coil. And the patient is able to come into the patient table this way, and it really affords a more open view, as the name suggests. And so the wide patient table, the large opening, and open view of these open bore systems is advantageous for imaging the pediatric, bariatric, and geriatric populations, as well as anybody who is claustrophobic. And so with our experience using COMSOL to solve this problem with the closed bore system, we were able to leverage that to then start solving that same type of problem for open bore MRI. And even though these coils are quite different, a lot of the same physics were used, and the setup for the actual model was fairly similar. So when it comes to RF heating in open bore, we've got a comparison here across the top row of open bore electric field and the gel phantom versus the closed bore, and you can see that it has a very different electric field. As we look down below, we've got a knee implant, and we can see that causes a different resonance of the same device at 1.5 T closed bore versus an open bore system. And so really the strength of the tool, in this case COMSOL, is to be able to help us identify these trends. We can very quickly and relatively easily look at sensitivity analysis. We can foster a better understanding of what's happening in the physics and how these devices are behaving to the electromagnetic fields. As I said before, we were able to leverage a lot of the same setup, the same physics in the COMSOL model, but we certainly had a lot of work on the front end to model and tune this very new RF coil. But once you get over that initial hurdle, you can really start to look at parametric studies and sensitivity studies to get a better understanding of a new technology in this same field. So we've talked a lot about MRI labeling and the different tests and experiments and simulations that are performed in order to get this MRI label. So here's an example of what that would look like. And this is what would go in the instructions for use for a medical device. And it would outline the device name, the field strength, various different parameters that are important to the MR technologist and the radiologist in order to keep a patient with that device safe during an MRI scan. So with some final remarks, we've been able to successfully use COMSOL to reduce timelines and costs and improve accuracy for our clients. We've evaluated many different types of medical devices and supported numerous global regulatory submissions with data from COMSOL multiphysics simulations. In our experience, COMSOL has been a very powerful and efficient tool for solving a variety of complex multiphysics problems. And I'd like to encourage people to not be afraid to leverage other experts, whether it be other people using COMSOL or even the COMSOL certified consultants to get help if you come up with a roadblock. So thank you for your time.